The world seemed to stand still as tensions between India and Pakistan reached a breaking point. On both sides of the border, soldiers stood in rigid silence, their fingers brushing against triggers, ready to answer violence with violence. Families huddled together in fear, whispering prayers into the night, uncertain if the morning would bring peace or devastation. Television screens flashed with urgent headlines, each one louder than the last, painting images of destruction that felt all too real. The world's greatest fear was no longer a distant possibility, it was at the doorstep, knocking with the sound of marching boots and roaring fighter jets. Yet, in the middle of this storm, a surprising figure emerged. Donald Trump, the former President of the United States, known for his unorthodox style and commanding presence, made a decision that stunned both allies and critics. He refused to stand by as two nuclear powers edged closer to disaster. Instead, he chose to step forward, not as a politician seeking attention, but as a man who understood the weight of humanity's survival. With his eyes fixed on the larger picture, millions of lives, countless families, and the fragile thread of peace, he resolved to intervene. In a moment where every second mattered, Trump carried not the weapons of war but the words of reason, believing that even the loudest guns could be silenced by the power of dialogue. The world held its breath, waiting to see if one man's determination could stop an entire region from collapsing into chaos. Donald Trump's first move was not to issue threats or ultimatums but to make a phone call. His voice, calm yet urgent, carried across oceans to the offices of both India and Pakistan's leaders. He did not speak of politics, power, or territory, he spoke of people. He reminded them of the children who would grow up without fathers if war erupted, of the mothers who would bury their sons, and of the countless innocent lives that would be lost before the first day of battle even ended. He painted a picture of not just cities burning, but dreams reduced to ashes, of progress set back decades by a conflict no one truly wanted. His words were simple but powerful: peace is the greatest victory any nation can claim. The world listened with surprise. Trump, once known for his fiery speeches, was speaking with a sincerity that caught even his critics off guard. He urged both sides to think not as rivals, but as guardians of their people's future. He spoke of trade that could bring prosperity instead of bloodshed, of bridges that could connect hearts instead of walls that divided them. For a moment, silence followed his words, a silence not of resistance, but of reflection. Across boardrooms and war rooms, leaders began to realize that the cost of war would be far greater than the pride of compromise. And in that silence, a seed of possibility was planted: maybe, just maybe, peace could still be chosen. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere was heavy with suspicion. Delegates from both India and Pakistan sat across long tables, their faces stern, their voices edged with years of mistrust. Every proposal seemed to falter, every gesture met with hesitation. The weight of history, wars fought, promises broken, wounds still unhealed, loomed over the room like an invisible wall. At moments, it felt as though the talks would collapse entirely, dragging the nations back toward the brink of war. Sensing this, Trump shifted the conversation away from maps and military strategies. Instead, he spoke of the people whose lives hung in the balance. He told stories of Indian and Pakistani farmers who shared the same rivers to water their crops, traders who laughed together in bustling markets, and children who secretly exchanged cricket scores across the border. His words carried no judgment, only truth, that beneath the uniforms and the flags, ordinary people on both sides longed for the same things: safety, opportunity, and a chance to dream. For the first time, the leaders began to listen differently. The room softened, the tension loosened. It was as if a window had opened, letting in air that had been shut out for decades. They saw not just enemies, but neighbors, bound by a shared humanity. In that fragile yet profound moment, the possibility of peace became more than an abstract idea, it became something real, something within reach. The silence that followed was no longer hostile. It was the silence of realization. The night dragged on, the conference room lit only by dim lamps and the tired eyes of those who carried the burden of millions. Papers lay scattered, coffee cups stood half empty, and the air was thick with uncertainty. Every word felt like a gamble, every pause a reminder that failure could mean war. Then, amid the tense stillness, one leader finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost trembling, but his words carried weight. If our people can dream of peace, why can't we? The sentence lingered in the room, echoing deeper than any speech or negotiation had before. Eyes shifted, expressions softened, and for the first time in hours, both sides looked at one another not as rivals, but as men burdened by the same responsibility. Trump leaned forward, his voice firm yet gentle, urging them to honor that dream, not for their own pride, but for the generations to come. Slowly, signatures began to mark the ceasefire agreement. What had seemed impossible just hours earlier was now written in ink. Outside, the roar of artillery fell silent, replaced by an almost sacred stillness. On the borders where guns had pointed, soldiers lowered their weapons and stood in quiet disbelief. The world, watching from afar, erupted in relief. What unfolded that night was not just a political decision, it was a human triumph. For the first time in years, hope had broken through the shadows of hostility. At sunrise, a new chapter began. The border, once lined with fear and barbed wire, echoed instead with laughter and relief. Children ran across fields that only yesterday had been scarred by the threat of war. Traders reopened their stalls, their hands exchanging goods instead of clenched fists. Families separated by decades of conflict embraced through tears, their hearts heavier with joy than with sorrow. It was as though the land itself sighed in gratitude, welcoming peace after years of silence and gunfire. From a distance, Trump observed the unfolding scenes, not with triumph, but with quiet satisfaction. He did not stand before cameras to claim glory. Instead, he allowed the moment to belong to the people who had suffered longest and gained the most. He knew that real victory was not his to own, it belonged to every child who could now dream freely, every parent who could watch their loved ones grow without fear, and every soul who believed that peace was possible, even when it seemed impossible. The world, once frozen in fear, now carried a new story to tell, not of destruction, but of reconciliation. In the hearts of millions, a seed of hope had been planted, proving that even in the darkest of times, compassion could spark change. And as the sun rose higher that morning, it carried with it a simple truth: peace is not the achievement of one leader, but the shared triumph of humanity choosing love over hate.